is our continuing series on Islamic biomedicine, sponsored by the Temple Theologian Trust and co-collaborated through my program at the University of Chicago, the Initiative in Islamic Medicine, and obviously the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. After today, we will be about 3/4 of done, so you will have survived. Some of you haven't survived, it looks like. About 3/4 of the talks. There will be 2 more after. But today, as 2 weeks ago, we have the pleasure of having 2 invited guests with us today to talk about Islam and biomedicine. Particularly, we have Professor Pormann who will give our lecture, and then we have Professor Ahmed who will give a response to that. So, with that in mind, today you can see already the title that we have for the program today is Medical Epistemology Changed, but Medical Epistemology in Arabic Discourse. So Professor Pormann comes to us from the University of Manchester, where he is the Professor of Classics and Greco-Roman Arabic Studies. He was previously here at Oxford doing some work on the history of Islamic medicine. He has several books and publications on that. But more recently, he's been working on the Arabic commentaries on the Hippocratic Aphorisms and then medical traditions in the Islamic world. He is, I can't say the French, but he's edited three volumes. The French book, you will have to something about construction of medicine in medieval Arabic world.
نشأة الطب العربي في القرآن.
Oh.
It's actually in Arabic, not in French.
And medicine and philosophy in the Islamic world, and 1001 Cures, contributions in medicine and healthcare from Muslim civilization. So with that introduction, we are very delighted to have Professor Pormann here to present to us.
Yes. Awesome. Thanks for this kind introduction. So basically, what I wanted to come to talk to you about is the Hippocratic Aphorisms and the commentaries on the Hippocratic Aphorisms, but little by little, I was pushed in a different direction. So the aphorisms will recede into the distance, and I will talk more about epistemology as something that is more relevant to this seminar series. And there will still be a little bit of aphorisms, not least because I want to brag about the results of my project, but we will really focus on epistemology, and as so often start with the Greek heritage, which is so important, and its translation into Arabic, and then look at some of the luminaries, some of the most well-known scholars of the Islamic tradition, notably Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi and Ibn Sina, and then also stop with 2 commentators or later authors, Ibn Nafis and Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, and finally I will come, hopefully, if I still have time, I will come to one of the commentators from this large tradition of commentators on the Hippocratic Aphorisms. So that's kind of the program for tonight, and I'll start with the aphorisms. So what are the Hippocratic Aphorisms and why are they important in the context of medical epistemology? So they're a body of texts in 7 books, utterances that give you all sorts of advice. Like for instance, 1.3 says, you should never be at the absolute top of fitness, because then you can't go any further. You should just be a little bit below that. There are other aphorisms listing children's diseases, other aphorisms yet. For instance, talk about melancholy. If fear and despondency last for a long time, this is something melancholic. That's another aphorism. And many of these aphorisms have triggered a whole tradition of debate, exegesis, sometimes even whole fields of inquiry, such as with pediatrics, where many later authors who write on pediatrics refer to these 2 Hippocratic aphorisms from Book 4 on pediatrics. So they are very influential, and nearly all of you will know the first of these aphorisms. Life is short, the art is long, opportunity fleeting, experience treacherous, and decision difficult. This is technically only the first half of the first aphorism, but this is something to which we will return towards the end of the lecture at greater length. And this experience is treacherous. That part is what we will home in on later on, because one of the debates is about should one use experience or rather rational thinking when discovering whether certain remedies work or don't. So this text was written by Hippocrates, or it's attributed to Hippocrates. It's probably from the late 5th century BC. But importantly, Galen of Pergamum, who lived roughly from 129 to 216, wrote a commentary on these 7 books of clever utterances, these aphorisms, and this was then translated into Arabic, as we shall see a little bit later. But there were also other commentaries on these aphorisms, some of them lost, such as by Rufus of Ephesus, other partially extant, others fully extant, such as that by Stephen of Alexandria in the 6th or 7th century, which displays a very different outlook to that of Galen, reflecting the teaching of late antique Alexandria. And there was also an Arabic manuscript held privately or there still is, hopefully, in the Haddad collection, thought to contain an Arabic translation of Palladius's commentary on the aphorisms. Palladius is an author of the 5th century AD or thereabouts, active in Alexandria. And we have recently shown, my aphorisms team has recently shown that this is actually not Palladius but pseudo-Palladius. So it is a commentary that incorporates a lot of late antique material but must have been written in Arabic. So there are numerous commentaries, let's say, in the Greek tradition, and some of this is also translated into the Arabic tradition, as most importantly that by Hunayn. So if we look at the Arabic tradition and this commentary tradition, we will see that there's Hunayn's translation, and then we have a long list of authors whose commentaries are extant. So they're not just, apart from al-Rhazi, Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Rhazi, for whom we have just fragments, the other authors here, An-Nili, Ali ibn Ridwan, Ibn Abi Sadiq, As-Sinjari, Ibn Baja, fragmentary, Musa ibn Ubaidillah, Al-Qurtubi, so Maimonides, Abdul Latif, al-Baghdadi, Al-Minfakh, or Ibn al-Minfakh, 2 commentaries attributed to Ibn al-Nafis, one of which extant here in a unique manuscript in the Poker collection, Ibn al-Quf, and then As-Siwasi, Al-Kilani, then there's this Ibrahim al-Kishi and Abd al-Rahim al-Tabib, I'm sure, whose names you've never heard, and al-Manabi. So some of these authors are quite famous or a little bit famous, others are totally unknown, but as you can see, there's quite a bit of material here. So even if we discard Ibn Baja and al-Rhazi, we still have at least 13, 14 commentaries, some of which of considerable length. And this is just by way of advertising or advertisement. All these commentaries are now available under a Creative Commons license, free of charge, for anybody to use in any way. You can print them on T-shirts and sell them, on the High or the Broad or wherever you like. That's fine, or you could do some research with them. So we've put all that material into the public domain, and a small bit of this material you will see tonight. So this is like a huge tradition, and it shows, and this is a point to which I shall return, it shows the importance of commentaries, and commentaries as a kind of a locus of intellectual debate. Now, as I say, we've put all this stuff in the public domain, and we've recently published a double issue in Orients with articles around all this. So if you need a guide kind of towards what a good place to start is this Orients article, which lists all this. Now, let's start with the main topic of today, medical epistemology. And Hippocrates wrote one book called On Ancient Medicine, which deals, for instance, with problems of medical epistemology. So asking, what does it mean for medicine to be a techne, to be an art, and how should one proceed? And this is a work which Galen rejected, and which many people in the intervening years then regarded as spurious, not by Hippocrates, but and so there's virtually nothing known in the Arabic tradition. This is why it's not here. But there are other texts that, like from early on, that ask this question: how can we know that a drug works? How can we know how the body functions? And these are debates that go back, as I say, to Hippocratic times, to at least the 5th century BC, if not earlier. They continue in Alexandria in the 3rd and 2nd century BC. And when we come to Galen, we find like a fairly important tradition and debates that are reflected in the writings of this remarkable physician. So I'll just give you two insights into these debates. One is by talking briefly about on the sects for beginners, the Arabic title being Fi Firaqat. So this text basically presents three main sects. So they are the Empiricists, the Rationalists, and the Methodists. So let's deal with the Methodists first, because it's very easy. So the Methodists have this idea that there are three states of the body, like there's stricture, when the pores of the body are closed, there's flux, when things flow, and then there's a mixed state, when some parts of the body might be, the pores, the passageways might be open, and other parts of the body might be suffering from stricture. So it's a very simple doctrine as it's presented by Galen, and Galen just dismisses them. And so we do not really need to concern ourselves much with these Methodists, although the word stricture, stagnosis, will come up later once, and so I'm just reminding you that you can look forward to that. But more importantly is this differentiation between the rationalists and the empiricists. So the Methodists were a real school. So there are people, names attached to it. They had some sort of collective identity. The same cannot really be said about the rationalists and the empiricists, because although we find later lists of school heads and people classed in one way or the other, in reality they did not have the same cohesion. So you have to really see these two positions, the rationalist and the empiricist, as Galen giving us theoretical outlooks how to approach what we can know about drugs and how they work. So let's start with the empiricists, because that's fairly easy. The empiricists say the human body is very complicated. It's very complicated, so we can't really know what's going on inside the body. Even if we open up the body, let's say of a living being, the stress, the trauma of opening it up completely changes everything, and so there's no way that we can observe the normal functioning of the body. Therefore, let's not try to find the inner workings of the body, the hidden causes, but let's just use what works. And how do we do this? There's this tripod, basically there's this tripartite division of things that one needs to do. Seeing for oneself, if I as a physician observe, for instance, that if I apply cream to an ulcer or a blister and that helps, then next time I can do it again, and I basically have my own experience to fall back on. Then this is called autopsia, seeing for oneself. Then there's historia, so the account of others who have seen for themselves. And then thirdly, there's what is called metabasis to homoioes to homoion, so the transfer of something from one thing to something similar. So for instance, if a salve works on the hand, it might work on the foot. If a lemon cures your sore throat, maybe a lime will too. So similar things might be used, and this is these three principles which the empiricists have. Importantly, they just look what works, and they don't ask why. This is the empiricist position. Then the rationalists are basically the contrary. They say, oh no, we can't just use experience like that. We need to understand how the body works, why things function, how things are caused, and this will then allow us basically to cure people, because we know the underlying causes of disease, And by then addressing these underlying causes, can we find a cure? Easy peasy, right? So Galen himself gives the example of rabies, and so the Methodists are kind of beyond the pale. But both empiricists and rationalists do the same thing. If a rabid dog bites you, what you do is you keep the wound open, you clean it. But for different reasons. So for the empiricists, they say, oh, we've seen in the past, if we keep the wound open and wash it and keep it clean and not let it heal, then the chances of somebody not contracting rabies are much greater. So I've seen it for myself, autopsy, other people have told me this. So that's kind of the reason, and this is the treatment. The rationalists do the same thing, but for different reasons. They say, the rabid dog has a poison, eos, in Greek, some in Arabic, and this poison penetrates kind of the blood or the body and does harm. So we have to prevent it from penetrating, and we need to counteract this poison through other remedies. And this is why they, again, wash the wound and not let it heal. So same outcome, different explanations according to Galen. Now in later times, so there's like in the 5th, 6th century, when many of Galen's texts are summarized in late antique Alexandria, people say, oh, the empiricists do it wrong and the rationalists do it right because they really favor this rationalist sect. But Galen himself basically gives you a mixture. So what then is Galen's own position? Did he adhere to empiricism, or was he a rationalist? And then we have to say, well, a bit of both, because he favored a concept of di horis mene pera, so a qualified experience. So he said, you can't just do random experiences. You need to have certain conditions that are fulfilled. And I give you one example that of critical days, where at the beginning of the second book, Galen thinks about how do we know which critical days, so kind of days during a disease when there's some sort of paroxysm where things come to a head. How can we know when this happens? I mean, obviously fever is one thing, but there are other diseases and sometimes they recur. So how do we determine these days? And he says, well, we can't just rely on simple experience. We have to kind of construct our tests in certain ways. So not all patients are suitable, but only those about whom there's no doubt. The patients must know exactly when the crisis comes about. So it doesn't help if the patient is more or less comatose and maybe there's a paroxysm and you don't even notice it. So the patient has to be alert. There has to be clear sense perception. That's the word that Galen uses there. And if there's a prolonged crisis, we need to know which day exactly was the first when this crisis was brought about or thereabouts. So these are certain conditions, and this is an important principle. And when these texts get translated, so on the Sects for Beginners was the standard text in late antique Alexandria. All medical students started with On the Sects for Beginners. Same in the Arabic tradition at the beginning of the curriculum. So On the Sects for Beginners was translated, as was On Critical Days. Glenn Cooper produced an edition of it maybe now some 5-6 years ago. Very thorough and thick tome. And this vocabulary of testing, let's say, to carry out a test, to put to the test, to test, is then rendered into Arabic with words like mihna and imtahana, so to test, or the standard translation for pera and empiriya for experience. Again, is tajriba, and we will see this again. And this is less intuitive for those of you who deal with Arabic theology or possibly even jurisprudence. Qiyas, basically in this context, means the use of reason and is opposed to tajriba. And the empiricists actually are called ashab tajriba, so kind of those who do tajriba, who do experience. And the rationalists are called ashab al-qiyas. And the Methodists are called ashab al-hiyal, but I mean that's neither here nor there because we're not going to deal with them. So these were the debates in Greek times. They are on the mind of people. People are interested in them, and then they get translated into Arabic and form kind of the basis for all this. Now I'm going to give you a few examples of scholars basically who deal with these questions of medical epistemology, and let's see what they do. So the first is a letter by Rhazes to one of his students. It's a text basically on medical ethics or medical deontology, as some people say. How should one comport oneself, for instance, in the presence of the lady in a harem, or how should one deal with servants, and so on and so forth. It's a very interesting text. And in this text he says, leave aside what confuses common idiots, namely the idea that one can hit on the right treatment by experience without any reference to scientific knowledge. For such a thing does not exist, even if one were the oldest person, because the benefit which one derives from an approximate treatment in such a case is merely the result of good luck. Even if the only thing written about the topic of experience were what Galen had said, I would still prevent those who consult me about the art of medicine from being treated by experience. The wise teacher Hippocrates barred it as well when he began his book of Aphorisms by saying, life is short, the art is long, the right time is fleeting, and experience dangerous. By my life, he was right in saying this, and I certainly prohibit experience in the medical art. So here you have Rhazes clearly dismissing experience, and this might lead you to think, okay, there's Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Rhazi, allegedly the greatest clinician on earth, well, at least during the medieval period, and why would he not use experience? Of course he does use experience, but not just any kind of experience, but he adheres to that Galenic doctrine of qualified experience. So you need to know the rules, you need to have a sense of what's going on, and only then can experience yield fruits. So here, in this epistle, of course, he quotes the aphorism, and you see that the aphorisms here, and especially this first aphorism with experience is treacherous or dangerous, kind of triggers a reflection on medical epistemology. Now, Rhazes did write a commentary on the aphorisms, of which we only have quotations in later commentaries. There's quite a bit of it, and that's like one of the many projects which I would like to do, is to collect these fragments. He also wrote a book, The Doubts About Galen, in which he has a section on the aphorisms towards the end. And he wrote a book called the comprehensive book, Al-Kitab al-Hawi, in which he has many quotations from both the aphorisms and Galen's commentary on the aphorisms. And Manfred Ullmann is my teacher and my esteemed teacher, I should say, and one of the people I have the greatest regard for. But he, in 1970, went through this whole thing, 23 volumes by hand, and found 20 quotations from the aphorisms themselves, and just one quotation from Galen's commentary. And in our project we found 82 from the lemma, so from the Hippocratic text, and 178 from the commentaries, and we were very, very happy about this, if you see what I mean. But this is again just me bragging and showing you how electronic code are actually quite important. Now, I just want to give you one other example where we can have a reflection on medical epistemology in relation to the aphorisms, and that comes from the Doubts About Galen. So he quotes one aphorism: those who suffer from gripes, pains around the navel and the loins, when they are removed neither by purging nor in any other way, end up suffering from dry dropsy. So that's what the aphorism. Then Galen's commentary, in part, is not the whole commentary, states that this kind of dropsy is called drum-like dropsy by later physicians, because when one knocks against the epigastric region, it gives out the sound like that of a drum, of drums. What we have here now is this, the quotation and the commentary by Galen, and then the doubts about Galen both will flare up briefly. So he says the fourth book, the aphorism which begins, he doesn't give a number, but everybody will know which aphorism this is, those suffering from gripes and pain. Galen said, and he will just highlight very briefly the beginning of the passage that he's engaging with, and he doesn't give you the rest of the passage, so you really have to know your Galen in order to understand what's going on in this book. And my former student Pauline Coetzee is just about to publish a French edition and translation, critical edition and translation of this text. And I think, this will be a big step forward, because the editions which we currently have are pretty substandard. So this just as an aside. So Galen said, when these pains are located around the navel and the small of the back and cannot be dissolved by a purging drug or any other treatment, then in the parts of the body there is a bad temperament which overpowers them, these parts of the body, and in most cases leads to drum-like dropsy. So istisqa, doubly, it's the Arabic term here. I reckon that this quotation does not constitute a commentary on this aphorism, for it does not provide any cause for this phenomenon at all. So that's the criticism which Al-Rhazi has, and he goes on to say, I have seen this more than once, and that means more than once, means many times, more than once in the hospitals in Iraq and in my home in Rai. In some of these patients, drum-like dropsy followed, but in others, strenury, and in yet others, a pain in the hip. Since I noticed this many times, whilst neither purging nor warm drugs which expel wind were of any help for them, I applied myself to giving them enemas which provide heat and fatten the region of the kidneys. I made the patients sit in warm sand up to their chest. I made some of them constantly attend dry steam baths. A third of them were cured, whilst 2/3 were affected by dropsy more quickly than those who were not treated, but by a lighter variety of dropsy. I did not, however, see that anyone recovered from drum-like dropsy. So he gives a whole reflection, and of course he talks about his own experience, and in this case even hospital experience, to criticize Galen, to engage in this problem of how exactly to treat drum-like dropsy and under what conditions it can occur. And interestingly, he uses statistics as well. So this is a topic on which one could say more, but this idea of using numbers comes up in Al-Rhazi more than once, and it obviously is an important part of modern medicine. I'm not saying that this is exactly like modern statistics, of course it isn't, but it is interesting nonetheless. So we leave Al-Rhazi behind, and we leave to lesser extent for a moment at least, we leave the aphorisms behind and come now to Ibn Sina, Avicenna, who lived from 980 till 1037. Who's mostly known as a philosopher, probably the most important medieval philosopher, and certainly within the Arabic tradition, but also a watershed in the history of medicine, notably by writing this Canon of Medicine, al-Qanun fi Tibb, which gets translated into Latin and becomes a standard university textbook until the 16th, 17th century. So again, that's a different topic. There are many interesting observations about the nature of science and medicine and theory versus practice. I'm not going to go into this. I'm just going to show you one example of an interesting discussion about epistemology, and this is how do we know how drugs work, and notably how can we attribute certain primary and secondary and tertiary qualities to drugs. So how can we determine them? So in the Galenic system, Galen wrote a text called On Simple Drugs, and in this text he basically introduces a system where there are primary qualities like hot and cold and dry and wet, and other secondary tertiary qualities like, astringent or maybe mudir al-bawl, so kind of provoking diuretic, like so basically making you pee more, and so on and so forth. There are different qualities and they have degrees. So the qualities existed beforehand, but Galen seems to introduce this theory of degrees. So there's a first, second, third, fourth, fifth degree for many of these drugs. Again, this would be a topic in and of itself, but Avicenna basically asked himself, so how do we know how these drugs work? How can we attribute certain qualities and degrees to the drugs? And he comes up with a list of 7 conditions, shara'it, singular sharita, through which, when one uses experience to determine them, which need to be fulfilled in order to use experience. He also has a section on using logic to do, using reason to do this. But let's stay with the experience here. So he says, the drug should be free from any acquired quality. The experience should be conducted on a simple illness. It should be tested on a drug and its opposites as well. The strength of the drug should correspond to the strength of the illness. The time that the drug requires to take effect should not be too long. The effect should be constant and occur in most cases. So you see this idea of quantifying uncertainty here. Human body should be used for testing, not that of animals. So there are like these conditions, and they don't have a match in the Greek tradition. This is what he came up with, and this is what he proposes one should do. And obviously, this is de horis menepera, so this is qualified experience. But so that's not new, but the experience is qualified in ways that goes beyond the Greek tradition. So Afifi knows this. I like to talk about tradition and innovation. So you have like a bit of both here. So it is in the Galenic tradition, but goes beyond the Galenic tradition at the same time. So let's just look at this second condition here. Experience should be conducted on a simple illness. So just to give you a bit more context here, second, and to show you how Avicenna reasons here. Second, what is tested should be a simple disease. For if it were a compound disease and contained 2 aspects that require opposite treatments, and if one tried a drug against them, these 2 aspects, and it were useful, one would not know the true reason for this. For instance, if someone suffered from a phlegmatic fever, so a fever caused by an excess of phlegm, one of the 4 humors, black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, and we gave him agaric to drink, a drug, and the fever ceased, then one should not judge the agaric to be cold just because it helped against a warm disease, that is fever. It may perhaps be the case that it helped because it dissolved the phlegmatic disease matter or purged it. So it could have, it's not like the coldness, the cool aspect, but the purging aspect that is at issue here. For when the disease matter is depleted, the fever ceases. This is really essentially a benefit, but also something mixed that is beneficial accidentally, essentially in relation to the disease matter and accidentally in relation to the fever. So what he's saying is, agaric purges phlegm, and that's what it does. That's kind of has a purging effect. It doesn't have a cooling effect. But accidentally, so as a result, kind of as a byproduct, because this is a phlegmatic fever, we also have this this other effect, which is basically to reduce the fever. But it's not because of a cooling effect. And so if you have these mixed diseases, then it's very hard to tell, is this drug cooling or warming? Can't really tell. And this is why you should not have compound diseases. Murakab is the Arabic word, but simple, mufrad diseases. So very briefly, I think I probably skipped this. I'll just mention this. There has been some debate about whether or not Avicenna actually practiced medicine, and Christina Alvarez-Millan, a great scholar, wrote an article in 2010 arguing basically that the reports of Avicenna practicing medicine and curing love sickness and all these things, which we find in his biography / autobiography and in later sources such as Nizami, Jawhar al-Maqala, for instance. These reports are a myth. They're topos, literary topos, and he never really practiced medicine. And I've argued against this because I found quite a few instances in which Avicenna does talk about his own experience. But again, this is a little bit of a sideshow, so let's not waste too much time on this. So just this morning, I mean, I knew about this manuscript for a while, but just this morning I saw it, the original in the Wellcome Library, which is Ibn al-Nafis's commentary on Avicenna's Canon. And this is like a little bit of a gem, this manuscript. It's very long, 560 or so, very, very big folios with loads of text. And there are many, many commentaries on the first book of the Canon. So there are 5 books in the Canon. First book is Generalities. Second book is on simple drugs, from which we had just the discussion just now. Book 3 and 4 is on diseases from tip to toe and diseases that are not specific to a part of the body. And book 5 then is on compound drugs, so basically recipes. So there are loads of commentaries on the first book, the Generalities, Kulliyat of the Canon, but there are very, very, very few commentaries on other books. And here we have that by Ibn al-Nafis, and it's complete and it's wonderful. And you see here, this is Arshad al-Thani. This is the second condition, so to speak. And I'll just give you a very preliminary translation of what he says about this, just to show you that this debate about epistemology and what conditions you use to test drugs, how they continue. So Ibn al-Nafis says, the master discussed the reason for attaching this condition, so that you should use simple drugs, simple diseases. If this disease were compound and the drug would bring a benefit or a harm to it, then this would not indicate the drug's quality. We mean here by compound disease one that comprises a susceptibility to derive benefit from opposite qualities, regardless of whether its true nature is composed of a number of diseases or not. For this reason, the master gave the example of phlegmatic fever, the example which I've just explained. Know that this condition is taken into account only when the experience is conducted in case of disease, so not health. That follows like a short other discussion. If the master had stated that experience does not apply to a compound disease, this would have been a better way of putting it. So kind of he rephrases it and tries to make it clearer. Now you can't really take a lot away from this preliminary translation and this discussion, but it just shows you that this debate continues in the commentary tradition. Now, if I have like another 50 minutes, then I'll give you the example of Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, who discusses, so we leave Avicenna behind, we leave the simple drugs behind, and we come back to on the sects for beginners. So Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi is another interesting physician who acquired fame by basically observing that the skeletal structure of the jaw and the coccyx is different from what Galen thought, and in his book Kitab al-Ifada wal-I'atibar. But he also wrote a book called The Two Pieces of Advice, Philosophical and Medical Advice. And in the section on the medical advice, he says some interesting things about, how to conduct medicine and how we can know what works in medicine. So there he says Galen complained about the Methodist sect and the Empiricist sect. So here you see, by his time, basically the empiricists are in the bad guys camp although Galen himself is more ambivalent, but this has kind of this shift in meaning has happened by then. Our contemporaries do not belong to any of the three sects which Galen defined in his book, The Sects for Beginners, but rather rely on luck and chance, al-Baghdadi wal-Ittifaq, like a blind man shooting in error without knowing in which direction the target is. The sects of the Methodists and Empiricists know the direction of the target, but shoot in error without first examining its specific position. The rationalists know the direction and examine the position of the target, directing their errors there in the most perfect and correct fashion. The empiricists examine certain aspects of the target, such as its shadow, so that they deserve to hit the mark. So, like a little bit of a hierarchy here, and not quite full marks for the empiricist. The people of our town, however, do not examine the target nor its direction, and one is therefore surprised not by their making a mistake, but by their getting things right, whereas one is surprised by the mistakes of the rationalist and not their getting things right. So, this is like, like Horace, like in the Art of Poetry, Horace says, an old man should be laudato tempus acti se puero. He should praise the time when he was a young boy. So basically here, the good old days, basically. And for Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, the good old days were the days of Hippocrates and Galen. And in his age, everything is corrupt, and nobody reads Hippocrates and Galen any longer, and everybody reads the summaries or just the Canon. So he has like this rhetoric. So this is a little bit, you have to read the rhetoric here as well as you can't just take this straight. But then he explains to us how these sects work. Take a man who suffers from fever. A physician of each of the sects comes to him. The Methodist aims at loosening him insofar as the fever arose out of stricture. So I promised you stricture, here's stricture. The empiricist says, I have observed many times people suffering from such a fever are resorted to bloodletting and extracted such and such a quantity of blood until the patient fainted. Yet afterwards the patient recovered from his fever in one go. So this is, this autopsia, this is observing for yourself. The rationalist will make the fever into a genus, divided by its essential differences into three species. The rationalist then looks at the fever of this man to determine which of the three species it is. He determines that it is a fever which has disease matter. Then he divides this fever into its species according to the disease matter and determines that the fever is bloody. He divides the bloody fever into the pure and the mixed and finds that it's pure. So, he's making fun because this principle of division and sub-subdivision is pervasive in works like the Canon of Medicine, for instance. It's something which goes back to late antiquity, and he kind of pokes fun at these rationalists a bit. So we go on. He divides pure bloody fever into that which is purified and that which has begun to boil, and finds that it is that has begun to boil. Then he considers the location, age, the present time, the habit, the past regimen, and other things of a nature to change the diagnosis. From all these collected facts, he derives a picture of the necessary regimen. Then he lets the blood of the patient until he faints. I wished I knew who of these three physicians more accurately gets things right and errs less frequently. Yet no intelligent man can choose anyone other than the rationalist, judging him to be skillful and wishing him victory and success. So you see, like I gave you this example of rabies. You remember? Empiricists and rationalists basically doing the same thing. Here we have like the fever, like that. They both bloodlet until the patient faints. Both the rationalist and the empiricist, only the rationalists have like very good reason for doing so. They've done all these differentiation and differential diagnosis and God knows what, and have considered all these other things, and basically they end up doing exactly the same thing. It seems to me like sometimes that happens when you go to doctor nowadays. I shouldn't to say this in distinguished company here, but you kind of get antibiotics or aspirin or whatever, and that seems to be 50% of the therapeutical arsenal. Huh? So, in any case, we finally come back to the aphorisms, and this will not take long, and then I'll release you, and our friend al-Kilani. So there's this first aphorism which we've already seen. I'm not going to read it out again. I put here the Arabic just for you to see that I can do Arabic. So he says, whilst discussing this first aphorism, he says, Hippocrates mentioned experience before decision. So experience comes first and decision is difficult comes later. That's what he's talking about here. Huh? Which is explained by the rationalist as meaning reason. Although experience comes after reasoning and rank. So basically they say, how come experience is difficult? Experience is treacherous first, and then decision, qada, afterwards. If qada really means hukm, means kind of the rational act. It doesn't make sense. In order to teach us that there's things reasoning. This experience by the ignorant, although experience comes after reasoning and rank. In order to teach us, so this happens in order to teach us, that there's danger in experience that precedes reasoning. So experience without reasoning, not good. We already know this. This is experienced by the ignorant and the test of something which begins without reasoning and does not stem from a principle or guideline. This is the type of experience which the wise Hippocrates means by saying experience is dangerous, because a single disease varies according to whether the disease matter is plentiful or small, thick or thin. I mean, you get it, huh? It's like what Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi complained, simple or compound, and the similar accidental qualities associated with it. Thus, the single disease becomes multiple in number, and in a way it is experienced in as much as it is impossible to grasp all of these accidents by experience. So there's no way that experience can tell you every single aspect of disease. Therefore, you need reason. It is impossible for all the specific conditions of natural and unnatural states to occur, for not all these states are actualized in the bodies, and the time over which a single person is able to gain mastery in order to learn the natures of bodies and all their conditions, the nature of diseases and their extent, the faculties of drugs with which one treats them, the different drugs are of greater and lesser strength, the reason each drug is useful or harmful, and climates in relation to each disease without sound reasoning and general guidelines which encompass all of the specifics of this art. So, simply said, there are all these things. Even if you are 100 years old, you will not observe them all. So you need reason in order to be able to deal with individual cases, because they are so manifold. Some have said that the intended meaning of decision is judgment. In this case, its difficulty lies in judging the benefit and harm that follows from treating a severe headache, for example, with purging and bleeding, hot compresses, perfumes, and ointments. So this just goes to show you, this is the commentary by Kilani. Nobody has seen this, I'm pretty sure. Although you could have seen it now that it's freely available, but we had a hard time editing this. Went all the way to eastern Iran and so on and so forth. But this is interesting stuff. There are many interesting debates in al-Kilani about medical epistemology, about here, how one should use experience and what the conditions are. And the point that al-Kilani makes, and that Rhazes made before, and in a way Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi makes too, is that we really need this di horis mene pera, this qualified experience in order to see what's what. So to conclude, Martin Edwards, like some 12, 13 years ago, wrote in the Lancet in a series on keywords in the history of medicine or something like that about experience. About evidence, not experience, about evidence. Medical practice has been evidence-based since antiquity. What has changed is our understanding of what constitutes evidence. So, this is very important. So these debates about how do we know that drugs work, how do we know how the body works, they are very old, going back all the way to Hippocrates. And there are very interesting developments. There's continuity and change. There are very interesting developments that we find in the Arabic, in the Arabo-Islamic tradition. So they continue. There's some debt to the Greeks. I've stressed this more than once. But there are also new developments, as in the case of Avicenna, who gives us these 7 conditions that need to be fulfilled in order to know what qualities simple drugs have. Or in the case of Rhazes, who uses the hospital context to conduct a test on a scale and with methods that probably weren't happening in the same way. At least we have no evidence of that earlier on. And finally, the point I want to make is that, again, that commentaries, whether it's on the Aphorisms or on the Canon, commentaries are such an important place of intellectual debate, of development, of such richness that they really deserve to be studied much more. And Nachi and Fancy, more than anybody, has really worked on this and shown us that there are so many interesting things. So the real conclusion is that I show you this manuscript, which I've seen this morning, this 560 folio manuscript. It's probably at least 500,000, it might be 700,000 words long. Nobody has read this ever. Nobody knows what's in there. So what I've given you is islands of knowledge in a sea of ignorance, and hopefully we can sail ahead and find some new islands and find more instances of these interesting debates about medical epistemology. Thank you very much.